The morning the ice storm hit Ridgefield County, power lines snapped like rifle shots across the valley, roofs collapsed under the weight of frozen rain, and emergency crews stopped answering calls because the roads had become skating rinks. But on the hill above town, inside a small house crowned with what looked like overlapping tree bark, Naomi Prentice sat dry and warm beside her wood stove, listening to her neighbors' metal roofs buckle and tear while her own roof, the one they'd spent 18 months mocking, held without a single crack. She didn't smile, didn't feel vindicated, just stirred her coffee and waited, knowing it wouldn't be long before someone came knocking. 18 months earlier, Naomi had made a decision that turned her into the town's favorite punchline. She was going to replace her rotting asphalt shingles with birch bark, not as decoration, as the actual roofing material. Layer after layer of it, thick as armor, sealed with pine resin and overlapped like scales. The ridicule started the day the first delivery arrived. Naomi was 46, a widow who'd inherited the hilltop property from her husband after he died suddenly 3 years prior. She worked as a park ranger, knew the land better than most, and had spent her entire life watching old structures outlast modern ones for reasons nobody seemed to study anymore. So when her roof began failing and contractors quoted her $8,000 for standard replacement, she started researching what her grandparents' generation had used before asphalt existed. What she found changed everything. Birch bark, harvested correctly, layered properly, treated with natural sealants. Rot-resistant, flexible, waterproof, and in northern climates, nearly indestructible. She spent weeks gathering bark from fallen trees on public land, carefully peeling sheets during the right season when the cambium layer separated cleanly. She studied historical Scandinavian techniques, old Russian building methods, indigenous practices that had kept structures dry for centuries before tar paper was invented. Then she built her roof. The first time Dale Pritchard saw her carrying armloads of bark up a ladder, he was driving past with a truck full of feed. He stopped, stared, then drove straight to the diner. "Naomi Prentice is building a roof out of tree bark," he announced. The laughter started immediately. By the next week, it was all anyone talked about. At the hardware store, men shook their heads and muttered about moisture rot and fire hazards. At the co-op, women whispered that grief had finally broken Naomi's common sense. Teenagers drove past her property at night, shouting jokes about beavers and Lincoln locks. Nobody asked her why. Nobody wanted to understand. Naomi worked alone, methodically, through summer and into fall. She layered the bark in overlapping rows, each piece treated with a mixture of pine resin and linseed oil she'd rendered herself. She angled every seam downward, ensuring water would sheet off rather than penetrate. She built the layers thicker than any historical example she'd found, because she wasn't just copying tradition. She was improving it. The roof grew darker as the resin cured, taking on a deep amber-brown color that gleamed faintly in sunlight. From a distance, it looked almost reptilian. Organic. Alive. "Looks like something out of a fairy tale," one woman said at the post office, not kindly. "Looks like a fire waiting to happen." A volunteer firefighter added. Building Inspector Ron Kellum showed up twice, clipboard in hand, searching for code violations. Naomi met him both times with historical documentation, engineering principles, and calm explanations he didn't want to hear. Technically, she wasn't breaking any rules. The county had no specific code prohibiting organic roofing materials, and her structure met load-bearing requirements. He left frustrated both times. "You're going to regret this when the first heavy snow comes," he warned. Naomi just nodded and went back to work. By late autumn, the roof was finished, sealed, cured, tested with a hose to verify waterproofing. It was beautiful in a way that made people uncomfortable. Too different, too old, too outside the boundaries of what modern construction was supposed to look like. Winter came gently that year. Light snows. Cold but manageable. Naomi's roof shed snow like water, the slick resin-coated surface refusing to let anything accumulate. People stopped talking about it as much, moved on to other gossip. Then the forecast changed. Early March. A warm front colliding with Arctic air. Freezing rain predicted. Heavy accumulation possible. The kind of weather that made road crews nervous and hardware stores run out of salt. Naomi listened to the reports and checked her roof one final time. Ran her hands over the seams. Tested the give of the bark layers. still flexible despite months of cold. Everything held. She stocked her wood stove, filled water containers, and settled in to wait. The rain started just after midnight. Not frozen at first, just cold, persistent. Then the temperature dropped, and everything changed. By dawn, the world had turned to glass. The ice came down in sheets, coating everything it touched with a glaze so thick it bent tree branches to the ground and turned power lines into sagging ropes of crystal. Naomi woke to the sound of transformers exploding in the distance. Sharp cracks followed by darkness as entire sections of Ridgefield County lost electricity. She lit a lantern and checked the window. Outside, her birch bark roof gleamed under a thin coating of ice, but the layers beneath remained flexible, bending slightly under the weight instead of cracking. The overlapping design distributed the load evenly. Nothing pulled, nothing sagged. Down in the valley, she could hear the first metal roof give way. A long, grinding shriek followed by a crash that echoed across the frozen landscape. Then another, and another. By mid-morning, the damage reports started coming through on battery-powered radios. Route 34 impassable. 12 homes with collapsed or severely damaged roofs. Fires from downed power lines. Emergency services overwhelmed. Naomi's neighbor, Beth Carmichael, lived a quarter-mile down the hill in a ranch house with a standard metal roof installed just 2 years prior. Beth had always been polite to Naomi, if distant, never joining in the mockery, but never defending her either. Now her roof was failing. Naomi saw it through binoculars, a visible sag forming over the living room, the metal buckling inward as ice accumulated faster than the structure could bear. Beth's truck sat frozen in the driveway, encased in ice. No way out. Naomi pulled on insulated gear and stepped outside. The ice made walking treacherous, but she'd prepared for that too. Traction cleats strapped to her boots, a hiking pole in each hand. She moved carefully downhill, using fence lines and tree trunks for support, until she reached Beth's front door. She knocked. No answer. Knocked harder. Finally, the door cracked open. Beth stood there wrapped in blankets, her face pale, breath visible in the air. "Heat's out," Beth said quietly. "Roofs. I think it's going to come down." Naomi didn't waste time. "Get what you need. You're coming with me." Beth hesitated. "I can't just—" "Your roof is going to collapse, Beth. You can argue, or you can move." 10 minutes later, they were climbing back up the hill, Beth clutching a duffel bag and struggling against the ice. They barely made it halfway when a sound like tearing metal echoed behind them. Beth turned, watching her roof cave inward, the metal folding like cardboard under the weight of ice. She didn't cry, just stood there, staring. "Come on," Naomi said gently. Inside Naomi's house, the contrast was immediate. Warm, dry, the wood stove radiating steady heat. Beth stood dripping on the mat, looking around in disbelief. "How do you still have? Wood stove doesn't need electricity," Naomi said, handing her dry clothes. "Roof's holding because it flexes instead of fighting the weight." Beth changed in silence. When she emerged, Naomi had hot coffee waiting. They sat without speaking for a while, listening to the ice continue to fall outside, the occasional crack of distant damage punctuating the stillness. "I'm sorry," Beth finally said. Naomi looked up. "For not saying anything. When people talked about you. About this." Beth gestured vaguely at the ceiling. "I knew it was mean, but I didn't. I just stayed quiet." "Most people do," Naomi said. Another crash echoed from somewhere in the valley. Closer this time. By afternoon, more shapes appeared through the frozen landscape. People moving slowly uphill, seeking the one place that still looked intact. Dale Pritchard arrived first, his face red from cold and exertion. His own garage roof collapsed behind him. He stood at Naomi's door, unable to meet her eyes. "I need help," he said. Naomi stepped aside. Then came Ron Kellum, the building inspector, his truck abandoned a half-mile down the road. Then the Howards from the next property over. Then 3 more families from town, all seeking shelter from homes that had become uninhabitable. Naomi organized them with quiet efficiency, sleeping areas aside, with stove tended, water rationed, supplies inventoried. She moved through her small house like a field medic, addressing needs without judgment, without reminders of who'd laughed at her. Dale finally spoke up as darkness fell, and they all huddled near the stove. "You built this knowing, didn't you? Knowing something like this could happen?" Naomi considered the question. I built it remembering. Old methods survive because they worked. We forgot that when we decided newer always meant better. Ron Kellum stared at the ceiling, at the birch bark layers holding steady above them, while everything modern collapsed outside. I told you it wouldn't last, he admitted quietly. I know. I was wrong. Naomi just nodded. The ice storm lasted 3 days. 72 hours during which Ridgefield County transformed into a disaster zone. Collapsed structures, downed trees, roads impassable, power out across 80% of the region. Emergency crews worked around the clock just to reach the worst-hit areas, and even then, many families remained stranded, trapped in damaged homes, or sheltering in overcrowded community centers. But on the hill above town, Naomi's house stood unchanged. Her birch bark roof never buckled, never leaked. The layered construction absorbed and distributed weight so effectively that when the sun finally emerged and the ice began to melt, the water sheeted off in clear streams, leaving the bark beneath barely marked. Inside, 14 people shared space meant for one. It should have been chaotic, but Naomi's preparation extended beyond the roof itself. She'd stocked enough dry goods to feed a group, had stored extra blankets, kept medical supplies organized in labeled containers, maintained systems that didn't depend on infrastructure she couldn't control. Every detail mattered now. On the second night, Dale's daughter ran a fever. Naomi calmly retrieved children's medicine from her supplies and monitored the girl's temperature through the night. When Ron Kellum's wife struggled with anxiety as the storm continued, Beth sat with her, sharing space and quiet reassurance in a way that turned strangers into neighbors. People helped because there was no other choice. And in helping, they began to understand what Naomi had known all along. Survival wasn't about individual strength. It was about building systems that worked when everything else failed. On the 4th day, helicopters appeared. National Guard trucks pushed through cleared roads. Power crews began restoring lines section by section. Slowly, Ridgefield County started piecing itself back together. Naomi's guests left in groups as conditions improved. Each one thanked her. Several apologized. Dale stood at the door longest, his daughter bundled in his arms. I don't know how to make up for what I said about you, he admitted. You don't have to, Naomi replied. Just remember it next time someone does something different. He nodded and headed down the hill. Within a week, the story spread beyond the county. News stations aired footage of Naomi's roof, the only structure in the area that survived without damage. Engineering professors requested interviews. Historical preservation societies asked for documentation. YouTube videos analyzing her technique accumulated millions of views. But Naomi refused most requests. She wasn't interested in fame. She returned to work, resumed her routines, and spent quiet evenings maintaining her property exactly as she had before. What changed wasn't her life. It was the county around her. Building codes were re-examined. Organic roofing materials got a second look. 3 families commissioned similar designs, asking Naomi for guidance. She shared what she knew freely, walking them through bark selection, resin treatment, layering techniques, not because she wanted followers, but because knowledge unused was knowledge wasted. By autumn, a new phrase circulated through Ridgefield County, built like Naomi's roof. It became shorthand for something designed to last, to endure, to resist the kind of catastrophic failure everyone assumed was inevitable until it wasn't. One evening in late September, Naomi stood on her porch watching the sun set over the valley. The birch bark above her had darkened further with age, the resin cured to a deep, rich patina that would outlast her and probably the next generation too. Beth drove up the hill, carrying a basket. Made too much stew, Beth said, a lie they both recognized. Thought you might want some. Naomi smiled and invited her in. They ate together, talking about small things. The weather, upcoming harvest. Nothing profound. But as Beth prepared to leave, she paused at the door. You know what I think about most? Beth asked. That moment when my roof collapsed and you were already halfway down the hill. You didn't wait to see if I'd asked for help. You just came. Naomi shrugged. You needed it. But you didn't have to. After everything. No, Naomi agreed. But that's not why you prepare. You don't do it to prove people wrong. You do it so when things fall apart, you're ready to help hold them together. Beth smiled, nodded, and headed home. Naomi closed the door and returned to her wood stove, adding another log, listening to the familiar crackle. Outside, the night was clear and cold. Winter would come again. Storms would return. The world would keep testing everything built upon it. But her roof would hold. It always had.